So we've just finished watching Ida, Pawlikowski's film set in 1960s in Poland. Guy, what were your thoughts?
I think my initial sort of like the thing I liked most about the film watching it was how sort of stark and indirect and implicit everything is, if that makes much sense. It's sort of like there's all these kind of dialogue scenes in which the characters are sort of trying to have some kind of conversation. It just like loses all kind of momentum a couple of sentences in, and they're just like locking eyes in this weird way. And there's this stilted silence which lingers through the whole film. And Ida herself is sort of this very enigmatic presence who barely speaks at all and just has these very like intense eyes. And the film, which we should say is set in Poland in 1962, so sort of in the wake of, the Second World War and the Holocaust and the sense of communism and all the kind of the deeply violent, kind of difficult to sort of reconcile history around that. And I thought what the film did really well was kind of giving me a sense of how that sort of unspoken history permeates like very ordinary kind of interactions and conversations all the way through, if that makes much sense to you.
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense, and it's something I really felt along the way as well. I think what I noticed was the way that the one thing was that the camera is very rarely actually at eye level. Like often it's coming from above or below, and for me it is a film that is so that you feel there are all these kind of dead souls lurking around the characters in a literal sense, because both Ida and her aunt go looking for the remains of their family, but I think, as you say, this sense of a kind of unresolved history that's kind of like circling around them. And I almost felt like all these different slightly obscure camera positions were these kind of witnesses, these kind of dead souls, watching them. And I think I like what we say about it being very implicit, because it is a very unassertive film. It's actually very it's incredible how compelling it is for how flat it is. Like it's there's very little, it doesn't really rise and fall in terms of its, energy levels, and it doesn't really build. It is very, very flat. But I think what I found so interesting is the way that with each scene, you have this real sense that before you arrive, life is really existing, and then after you leave, it is carrying on. Because actually, when you think about it, each scene is very short. It's a moment in the bath, or a moment in the hotel, and I think I sort of not quite sure how it's achieved technically, but for me it really gives me the sense that there is a kind of life before and after.
There's a wonderful your discussion of that made me think of there's a scene I especially liked where Wanda and Ida are sitting in this hospital visiting the father of this man, Felix, who has repossessed what was once her family's home and had supposedly looked after or sort of sheltered Ida's parents during the kind of the sort of Nazi occupation and so on and so forth. And they're kind of there to sort of try to find out the truth about where they might be buried and, the sort of circumstances around their death. And the camera is set up in such a way that this man who they think might hold these truths is positioned in front of you off camera. And it's the two of them looking ahead, sort of like interrogating him. And Wanda, who's been the state prosecutor during this sort of the ascendancy of the communist government in Poland, is very much like, you can see that like that's what she does. She has a very like practice methodology, you can sort of tell. And that's all going on, and it's very like intense, and it's quite horrifying to see them asking these questions and not see like how this man is or isn't responding. And he's also never given a name, which sort of feeds into the whole thing as well. But then there's this other hospital patient who's just like lurking in like the bottom corner of the frame, and you can't quite tell if he's asleep or if he's awake or if his eyes are closed or they're sort of flickering in and out. And it's this really like intense emotional scene, and you're sort of like transfixed by it, like staring at the two main characters. But then you keep getting tugged away by this sort of like weird action in the corner. And I thought that seemed to really like encapsulate that sense of that thing that sort of pervades the movie, which is this sort of lingering kind of tugging, sort of like unexplained, sort of like blurred over, as you were saying, sort of distance, flattened, because I think that flattening is also a way in which you sort of like learn to live with those kind of things. You know, you hold it at distance, you sort of mute or kind of dull your experience of reality. And I think it's a very intense film, obviously, but it does also make present how you might kind of deal with a traumatic history by sort of desensitizing yourself in a certain sense. But that never quite works. And I think when you have that face of that man kind of tugging at your attention while you're trying to watch this very cathartic, also like aspiring to be cathartic moment in the film, that seemed to me to be a really kind of like apt metaphor for how that whole thing works.
It's so interesting because I think I had a very similar read on that scene, but through a slightly different part of it, because I suppose you're saying your focus was on this man in the background, whereas what I really noticed in that scene is as the aunt, you know, is asking these really, as you say, difficult questions about where they're buried and how they were killed. What we're looking at is like, I feel like Pawlikowski is showing, sort of tackling truth in spatial terms, because we're seeing her get closer to the truth, and actually as she gets closer, the camera moves further away.
Oh, yeah, I love
and
that.
Almost as if like she doesn't really want to know the truth. And I think that is a motif that recurs. There are so many little lies in the film. Like the film is actually bound together by these small lies. You know, the lie about I suppose, you know, Ida's true kind of origin, the lie about the aunt's, you know, son that doesn't get revealed till later, and so I think, yeah, and for me, I think that, and actually, sorry, as we go towards the end, you know, when sort of we're anticipating whether Ida will, you know, will she go return to the convent, or will she stay out in the world? You know, there's this sense that sort of whichever way you turn, there are, you know, we kind of live in our own fiction. But I think that scene in the hospital really, showed in spatial terms how sort of, I suppose, how truth, you know, works, and how our relationship with it is very complicated. And as much as we might believe we want to face it head on, there's also a sense that it is it's sort of too stark to look at directly, which I kind of feel the whole film is you know, is kind of commenting on.
And I think what you're saying, and it sort of also speaks to what you're just saying about that thing about like the sort of the fictions we live in and that kind of thing. Another thing that I liked that sort of came through in the film was the sort of, it's quite implicit, it's not sort of like the main kind of, I wouldn't say it's one of the main elements of the film, but there are these kind of parallels sketched between Ida having grown up in this convent and the sort of, you know, the kind of the rich sort of ritual and kind of performative aspect of that, where there's all these occasions and the kind of appropriate ceremonies that accompany them, and a particular way of kind of conducting yourself and dressing and so on and so forth. And I kept thinking about that in relation to these sort of like legislative systems. So Wanda, her aunt, has obviously worked as a state prosecutor, where you would have like, you know, put men to death for like their horrific war crimes as an attempt to sort of like excise the past, or excise this kind of unbearable element in the world. And then there's this other thing, which is when Felix, who's the man who's repossessed what would have been a family home, is kind of trying to make a deal with Ida. He says that he will take her to where her parents are buried and reveal the truth if she agrees to let them like keep the land or keep the house. And I thought that contrast between that kind of that there's at once a contrast and a sort of like deep, like rich comparison and sort of like intermeshing of these sort of like bureaucratic, like legal systems as ways of sort of like trying to like navigate things and organize things, and then these kind of more like metaphysical, spiritual things, which are both very like deeply transfixed in this idea of like absolution and catharsis, and like, you know, kind of ordering things so that they're fixed and done and you can leave them be and they don't haunt you. And I thought that was quite interesting. I mean, I might just be biased because obviously like this is my background, like growing up in South Africa and like the TRC and this kind of deep overlay of like legal, like legal ceremony and like religious ceremony, which is very much combined there. And yeah, there's a similar kind of process underway here, I think, in terms of this attempt to grapple with an unbearable history and these like very different, but also kind of, when you look a bit closer, deeply similar kind of mechanisms through which you might try and do that.
And I think another, similarity that kind of links the world of the convent and the outside world, because I think there's a tendency to, you know, from sort of our perspective, to look at it as you know, the convent equals kind of repression and almost imprisonment, and the outside world is freedom. Whereas, you know, in the Soviet era, there was the joke from zeks, from inmates in the camps, where they preferred to the outside world not as freedom, but as the Bolshaya Zona, which is like the big prison zone. It's like the bigger one, whereas the camps is just the smaller version, which is more inhumane and more dangerous. But the sort of outer world was no more free.
Yeah.
And I think Ida's final choice, you know, the moment of where she's asking her kind of potential love interest, you know, and then what? I think is a really fascinating one, and I think completely kind of unravels that binary of, you know, freedom versus a life of service. And I found that just a very kind of compelling choice, really. And in a way, it's like, in a way, I often felt during the film that as much as this is Ida's story, it is Wonder's, I think, actually, and to what extent Wonder is a kind of character in Ida's life, and to what extent Ida is a character in Wonder's life, because really Wonder is perhaps the character that sort of seemingly goes through a lot more and has somehow the story derails her, whereas Ida almost goes the opposite and becomes even more absolute in her path, which I guess was the film is set up in a way where you wouldn't really anticipate that, I suppose.
I guess it makes you think about what are the aspects of those two different characters that do or don't allow them to kind of endure that encounter with this horrific truth. And there's a sense in which perhaps like Ida somehow been trained via her like sort of enclosed, deeply sort of like deliberate religious upbringing to sort of like undertake this mission almost. There's one other scene which I really, really thought was worth drawing attention to, and is maybe quite a good kind of send-off, is this, well, for me at least, that was by far the most like intense moment of the film, is when they finally return to this site where Ida's parents are buried, and Felix is digging up their grave, and he just collapses like in this grave. And there's such a kind of contrast there for me. And again, to sort of call back to that hospital scene we were discussing, all the bones and all that, all off camera, there's still a sense of like, you know, there's no like grandiose reveal or kind of like, there it is, kind of like catharsis, now we can move on kind of moment. But I just thought about like the very intense like viscerality of that scene, where you kind of like, this person has been very like sort of perfunctory about this whole thing, and it's like, as I mentioned earlier, like framed it in relation to like property rights and like, you know, the claim on like a lot, you know, there's all these like weird parallels coming through, and then in this moment like surrounded by this like loamy, like rich soil, and like confronting this thing, and it's literally like all around him. It's just like inescapable. And there's a kind of the rest of the film is often so like kind of open, as you said. There's these weird sort of floating camera angles and these vast empty landscapes, and then in this moment there's just this like figure sort of forced to reckon with the past when there's no escape. There's none of the sort of evasive coping mechanisms we've been mentioning earlier. And yeah, it just like, it really hit me with this like deep emotional thud.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that scene, because I think there are two things that really sort of have stayed with me. And one, as you mentioned, he is, he is beneath the surface. He is underground, sitting, standing in this grave. And then that, I think, is mirrored later in a scene where Ida is talking to the statue of Jesus, saying, "I'm not ready to take these vows." And she is also standing what looks to be in this kind of demarcated circle that is also feels, as if it's beneath the surface. And I think it speaks to that sense that there is this inescapable communication with the past, with history, with the dead. And then the other thing I think is actually in that, when he is digging, there isn't this revelatory moment, but there is this difference in sound. As soon as he hits bone, you really hear metal on bone. And I think it is a film that utilizes sound, and actually it's what I think Pawlikowski does really well in his other films as well. Uses sound and music to kind of demarcate changes and rising and rises in tension, and it kind of adds a lot of, I think the sound really is the color. And I think that scene, as you say, really, really stands out to me. It's I suppose it is very gloomy, but I think it's one that, and there are, of course, there is a lot of violence and a lot of difficult moments, but it does kind of get beneath you in this hopeful way too, somehow. But maybe that's me trying to put a
think
spin on the end.
You could, it's a bit generous, but you could very much call it a hopeful film. I guess the hope would perhaps be that like we have to enjoy these things, but I guess we do. People improvise and invent new kinds of ways to do that. But yeah, I'm really glad to have watched it. It's been a pleasure talking it through with you.
Yeah, you too, Guy.
Cheers, Matt.
Cheers.